The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is charged with the idea of taking the lessons from the past and transferring them to our future.
As stewards of history in the Birmingham movement, the BCRI houses incredible collections that show and document where the community has come from and how the Birmingham movement both came to be and was so successful.
For more than 25 years, the Institute has educated people about what happened here in the 60s, not just in Birmingham, but across our country. Civil rights and equality challenged today just as they were many decades ago. We are here to enlighten each generation about civil and human rights by exploring our common past and working together in the present to build a better future.
Through many educational offerings, we teach the idea that the changes in Birmingham, Alabama were not just because of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Reverend Ralph Abernathy. A lot of these changes took place because of the youth in this city. And due to that, we have a mission to share with the youth of today what youth in their generations in the past have done. Through our Legacy Youth Leadership Program, we bring high school students from all over the Jefferson County area here to study this narrative and to serve as docents and ambassadors to the Civil Rights Institute. We have BCAP, which is the Birmingham Cultural Alliance Project, where we visit middle school students and we take them through this history and through this narrative so that they can prepare to understand their role in society. We have outreach programs that visit many schools and institutions to highlight the story of accomplishment, the story of overcoming, the story of a power and the movement that people in Birmingham were able to bring to bear to change not only the city, but the state, the nation, and the world.
By making it accessible to researchers and local students from middle, high, and university students, they're able to come in and see where we've been so that they can go and be better stewards of Birmingham and our present and then our future.
Thank you for joining us for this engaging virtual conversation series. We invite you to help us continue the work for civil rights through racial justice by becoming a member or donating to our work. You can find us on our social media platforms to stay connected with us. Thanks again for your support.
our continuing virtual conversation series here at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Our conversation this evening is redlining. No gate needed. Now, when we discuss redlining, we have a list of people here to bring a very powerful perspective to this topic. But as we begin looking, we want to talk about this idea of what makes America special. And we talk about the American dream, that the American dream has its roots planted back in England, where because of primogeniture and because of the feudal system, the idea of upward mobility was not very strong in that society. And that's what set America apart. The idea of being able to increase your position through private ownership of property. And the greatest property that most people will ever own will be their home. But there are obstacles that have been placed in the path of people seeking to achieve that equality. And as we examine these things this evening, I want to bring forth our panel and allow them to introduce themselves. And I will start out with Mr. Elijah Davis.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to be here virtually with you on this panel. I am the Strategic Growth Manager for Urban Impact, the Community Economic Development Agency for the Civil Rights of Fourth Avenue Business District and servant of the City of Birmingham. We're excited to really talk about redlining today and how we can both correct and move forward that legacy in the sphere of economic development, and always excited to celebrate Black History Month and every day of Black history with our partner, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. So thank you.
Elijah, thank you so very much for being here today. I'd like to introduce Attorney Antoine Thompson.
Yes, Antoine Thompson, National Association of Real Estate Brokers. Really excited to be here today. We are the oldest Black real estate association in the country with a strong commitment to fair housing.
Okay. And Miss Leila Hackett, excuse me.
The Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of Northern Alabama. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have been invited to be a part of this discussion. The Fair Housing Center has been around for about 28 years now, and we are the only fair housing center recognized by HUD serving the northern portion of the state of Alabama. We serve about 29 counties. So again, I'm delighted to be here and to be a part of this discussion.
Thank you so much. And we also have Kira Fontenot. And Mr. Thompson, pardon me for giving you a new title as an attorney. That title goes to Ms. Fontenot.
Attorney, and I represent people who have been harmed by discrimination in the federal courts in Alabama and a little bit in Georgia.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for being here. And when we look at this idea of redlining, we want to go back to 1865. And we go back to 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment. In quick succession, you're going to have the 14th and the 15th Amendment. 4 million people are no longer going to be enslaved in this country. But as the radical Republicans in Congress realized, there's not going to be a whole lot that they can do with their freedom without having some kind of sustenance. And in that sustenance, they talked about ensuring everybody 40 acres on a mule, and to try to bring together some sort of standing where these people who were newly freed could blend into society. But there was a backlash to that. And that backlash is going to go through the end of Reconstruction with the Compromise of 1877. It's going to extend to 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. And we're going to start seeing segregation extend its way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, from the Gulf of Mexico to Lake Michigan, and everywhere in between. And one of the key things about this retrenchment of rights was the idea of where people could live and how people could afford homes. And so I want to start out, Elijah, if you will basically give us a definition of redlining and talk a little bit about the history of it.
Well, I would love to give a definition, but I'm actually going to punt to Mr. Thompson because he's got to give you a better one. But it's really the practice of segregation, particularly on maps for the Fair Housing Act of 1934, of excluding folks from housing stock based on their race and also other socioeconomic factors. And this practice extended for many years. And so that is a real challenge that we have in terms of legacy and in terms of real wealth creation by zip code, by neighborhood that are still felt today.
Okay.
You know, one of the things that, first I want to thank you for having the National Association of Real Estate Brokers on this very important call. Redlining was really at the heart, strikes at the heart of discrimination in America. When we think about how it became institutionalized, and we talk about the institutionalization of redlining, really took full development in the 1930s under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Many of you say about a New Deal, and we need a new deal. Well, we got to make sure that this proposed New Deal is better than the old New Deal, because the old New Deal was when they created a number of programs right after the Great Depression to bring housing and liquidity to the mortgage market. So they created the Federal Home Loan Bank System, which is from coast to coast, to help people restore confidence into the mortgage industry. They also created what we know now is the 30-year mortgage. And then we know that the Federal Housing Administration and the GI Bill, two very important things that came out of the 1940s during World War II. And unfortunately, the federal government at that time created a system which said, where they literally, not figuratively, but literally threw red lines around neighborhoods and said if you were black or brown, that your neighborhood was a greater risk. And so it was less desirable, more likely to have violence, more likely to have poverty. And that went on for many years. And not only did that happen, they discouraged lenders from lending to black people, saying that if you lend to them, we will not guarantee your mortgage. And that was very significant coming out of the Great Depression, because a lot of folks lost their money in banks. A lot of financial institutions went belly up. And so redlining became a way to not provide access to capital for small business people. It also provided a way to exclude entire populations of people from being able to get mortgages. And what happened was people would enter into land contracts or contracts for deeds. and all these other predatory practices. And then when African Americans were able to get a mortgage, it had bad terms. And that process it continued on really to this day. Well, legalized redlining may not be permissible as of really in the 1970s with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and with the Community Reinvestment Act. The fact of the matter is that this country still has a situation where we put out a report every year called the State of Housing and Black America Report. And in that report, it shows that African Americans, regardless of what city you live in, are denied mortgages at twice the rate of whites. Twice. Black person applies, white person applies, a black person is twice as likely to be denied. And even when a black person has a similar credit profile as a white person, similar debt to income ratio, and a black person even can have an even better credit score, we are still overcharged or denied at a higher rate than whites. That's the new redlining. And then on top of that, now the new redlining is what we call loan level price adjustments, where they put points onto your system. You know, they put overlays onto your mortgage and making your mortgage more costly than the white. So you both may get a mortgage at $150,000, but over that 30 years, you're going to pay $250,000 and they're going to pay $200,000. That's the new form of redlining that we talk about every single day, and we fight against these issues very, very hard. So redlining is not over. It is alive and well. It just has a new cousin.
Well, you know, it's very.
I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I was about to say I would have to agree with both of the previous speakers. We do testing in the area. We do insurance testing. We do mortgage lending testing. We do real estate testing. And we have found that everything that they have said in terms of redlining, how it's still existing, how communities are being kind of put to the side so that they will not be strengthened with new monies coming in. We had an insurance agent several years ago who was actually brave enough to let us see a map that his company had sent him of certain areas in Birmingham that were encircled in red. And he was told not to write insurance policies for those areas, or if so, to make sure they had terrible rates on those policies. And so we know that redlining still exists. We know what happens in the mortgage industry. And as I said, we definitely know what happens in the insurance industry. We've had numerous tests to support redlining, and it still exists here in Birmingham.
Well, Ms. Hackett and Attorney Fontenot, you mentioned test, and without giving away work product or trade secrets, could you talk about how those tests are administered, or what's a part of that? What are you looking for?
Well, perhaps, but I don't know if you want to.
Both of you, Ms. Hackett, if you'll continue and then jump in, Attorney Fontenot.
Okay, we design tests to do rental testing. We do real estate sales testing. We do mortgage lending testing. And as I said, insurance testing. And we design a scenario and we make certain that our testers have the same basic characteristics. So if one of our testers has a $100,000 income, the other tester has a very, very similar income. So we make certain that there are no variables that can be had to make a difference in the way that they are treated, at least not from the way we design the test. And we've been testing for the whole 28 years that we've been here. And some of the results that we have found have been truly mind-boggling. We found a number of issues in the real estate market. We found a number of issues in the rental market. We found a number of issues in insurance and in mortgage lending. And we are currently testing as we have normally done.
So I wanted to maybe explain, so how do we prove discrimination, right? Because in the normal environment that we're in, you know, we used to have a time when people would say, I will not rent to you, or I don't want to pay, you know, I don't want to have Black people own my property after I leave. That used to be overt, but it's not anymore. And so what we usually need to do is to do sort of this testing idea, or to find a comparator. And so what you're looking at is you're trying to find a person who every person, for all intents and purposes, are the same, but gets a different result. So I walk in, we're both on time. Only one of us, we submit the application at the same time. The information is the same, but one gets a negative result and the other does not. And typically, once we are able to establish that there is a comparator, then the other side has to then tell us what their legitimate non-discriminatory reason for the decision was. And then we've got to prove that that's a lie. And so that's why those comparators are really important, because that's what teaches us, that's what the courts are going to use to determine whether discrimination has occurred. And it's often very difficult to prove discrimination without the use of some sort of comparison person who can make it very clear that there was no legitimate reason for the difference in outcome.
Absolutely. And if I could add, Barry, to what the other panelists have said, in terms of a test, there are some regulating institutions in the federal government, in addition to some of these local tests that banks have to adhere to. You mentioned the Community Reinvestment Act. That is typically the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and also one of the organizations that we're in network with, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. They do a lot of natural studies. One of the most perturbing studies that came out of the University of Utah last year showed still a 50% less callback rate for applicants trying to access capital. One of the things that the FFIEC does is looks at, banks and their credit, not just credit availability, but are there branches in neighborhoods? And one of their scores are mortgage loans and where those mortgage loans are. And I've heard it said many times that redlining is a form, or heard it coined as redlining is zip code apartheid. So to add to what the other panelists say, those are some of the regulatory bodies and agencies that do that. And unfortunately, we've had a bank in the Birmingham market to get slapped with a redlining fine just not even 5 years ago. I won't call the bank's name, but it is still very real.
If I could just throw some in there quickly, Barry.
Yes,
Two
please.
things. One is that what folks need to really understand is that most of the financial institutions in the country get a passing grade for their financial practices. And how could that be when I just told you that a Black person is twice as likely to be denied for a mortgage than a white person? So we've got to put some teeth behind the Community Reinvestment Act. It was watered down when it's passed. There's been some amendments to it, but it's not enough race-based policy in it, and that was one of the weaknesses when it was passed in 1977. So how could that be? The second thing is that we need to make sure that the home mortgage disclosure data, which tracks their lending practices on an annual basis, that's integrated more in their scorecard, and that these financial institutions are evaluated not every 5 years, but really every year, or no more than every 2 years. That's really, really important. The other dirty secret that people don't know is a lender cannot do very few loans to originations to Black people, and then right before their CRA exam, they can go purchase a bunch of mortgages from another institution, and they get a passing grade on their lending. That's another thing that needs to be change. The last thing I would say to the advocates out there is that if you are not on a bank's community advisory board, and if you have not commented on when your lenders or financial institutions are under review for a CRA exam, then that's part of your responsibility as a community leader, because the regulators look at comments from the community, and most of the time our Black people are not commenting when that organization is under review. So we can't do everything at the national level, but we need our local realtors. Shout out to the Birmingham realtors, Marcus Brown and all the folks out there in Birmingham, and all the activists and business leaders understand that it changes when you are on those corporate advisory boards, when you're commenting when they're under review, and letting your members of Congress know and your state legislators know that you're unhappy with the lending patterns. Most elected officials have no idea about the lending disparities in their area, and it's our job to make them aware.
You know, I want to ask you a follow-up question to something you said earlier. And as a historian that talks about the civil rights movement, we can overgeneralize things. And one of those overgeneralizations that I've just been introduced to talking to you is the idea that usually in terms of equality and equity, the federal government has been the good guy. You know, if you think about the Civil Rights Act of 1866 or 1957 or 1965, you know, it's always this federal presence reaching in and correcting the states. But I'm being exposed here to an idea where the federal government, instead of being the good guy, was actually on the wrong side of the equation.
Yeah, that's very true. You know, part of the thing is we fought so hard, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King fought so hard about the civil rights, but the part that he lost a lot of support on was civil rights, right? The third wave of the civil rights movement is about economic rights and economic equity, not just equality, because he said, what good is this desegregated lunch counter if the person doesn't have money to buy anything there, right? And so the federal government has a lot of challenges. We saw it last year with the Paycheck Protection Program. All these white companies got money, right? And then we're seeing it right now. We saw it with the crisis of 2008, where most Black people lost their homes, you know, over $3 trillion in wealth loss. But we found a way to make sure whites were helped. So we have to fight just as hard for economic equity as we fight against police brutality. They go hand in hand. It's not either or. We have to fight just as hard to make sure that cousin Jay can get a mortgage or get a small business loan. The same way we got to make sure that they have books in the classroom, desegregation in the classroom, that we don't have environmental racism, because all these other things stem back to home ownership. If you own a house, you're more likely to have your kids are more likely to do better in school. You're more likely to, if you need a small business loan, 40% or more small businesses start in the home, and you're more likely to live longer. We learned a lot from COVID, right? Black people dying more because a lot of our Black people are in nursing homes, senior citizen places, and in apartments. So home ownership is the bedrock of America. It always has been, and we got to fight for it. And the federal government has to do some restorative policies to deal with this historic discrimination that's very deep-rooted. You talked a little bit earlier. We know about 40 acres and a mule, but we don't talk about land grants that were given 5, 10, 100 acres to whites. We don't talk about the current things where we give development agreements to whites and land for $1, and then and provide low-cost financing and workforce development grants. The system has always provided economic incentive and stimulation for whites, and always it continues to marginalize Black people. And wealth building and land ownership is something we have to fight for, the same way we fight against these other things.
Elijah, you talked about this apartheid being drawn with these red lines. When we look at the different neighborhoods, just in our city alone, and can you talk to that in terms of how one neighborhood seems to thrive and how another neighborhood seems to, have blight and all these other kinds of things that decrease the property value? Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing to consider in the city of Birmingham's comprehensive plan, the first opening pages talk about the city's quest and understanding of civil rights begin with its urban policy, right? So from the Olmstead Act of the 20s and our most segregated city in the nation status, we tend to forget that the crescendo that leads to the demonstrations and the social innovation and the tragedy of 1963 is fueled by bombs, bombing him. Those bombs were trying to keep folks away from better regions, particularly when we think about Smithfield and Graymont. And so when we think about a demonstration and an icon that the world is influenced by, it's important to think about the 15 to 17 years before that was literally trying to not only enforce the and through redlining and discrimination, but through actual racial terror and violence, right? And so because understanding for many of the reasons that Mr. Thompson and others on the panel have already stated, the economic benefits, it's of great concern that people, particularly we're trying to, look at, how to keep African Americans away. In fact, in the redlining map that you all showed a little bit earlier, if you look, there's downtown, but notice that the housing stock is even depressed in Smithfield. Smithfield, you can walk from the city center to Smithfield, right? Smithfield is in the Smithsonian African American Museum of Culture in DC, has been a historic African American community since the 1890s, right? But yet it has one of the worst housing stocks. The other adjacent neighborhood in Birmingham, North Titusville, founded as sort of a township and where African Americans could first own and build houses in South Titusville, North Titusville, right? We have at one point in the mid 2010s, one of the most distressed by housing stock and dilapidation neighborhoods in the state. And so we think about sort of the real-time effects of the map that you all showed. And if we were to overlay that today, we still see the same issues, housing challenges. The green area where we would normally have Mountain Brook, over the mountain communities, has the second wealthiest zip code in the state. Right. So this is something that was invented almost 100 years ago and still live with us today in our present, and quite frankly, informs all of the issues that we have in our 99 neighborhoods and 23 communities. And we have to take steps for restorative policies today.
Ms. Hackett, I want to, and also Attorney Fontenot, I want to go back to the idea of bias and discrimination, but I want to go back to it from a foreign point of view. I like to tell people, you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know. So when I walk into a home and I'm a prospective renter or buyer, with these blinders on, what kinds of things should a person be, and not trying to make people paranoid, but what kind of things are like red flags should somebody look for to give them an idea that maybe they're not going to be treated fairly in this transaction?
Well, that's really difficult. I think one of the things that as consumers and as people of color, we have to be cognizant of is to we need to shop around, right? And so, sometimes we will take what other people say at face value. They seem to be an authority, and they tell you that's just what they cost. And because we are not as educated as we need to be about how to access systems of wealth and money, sometimes we will accept the first offer, like, because it seems reasonable. We don't have anything to compare it to. And so I think just like, we have a duty to educate ourselves about any other area, but when we enter into financial transactions with people, we need to test what people are saying to us to make sure that their intentions are pure. And, I can tell you that as a person and a person of color who's accessed, systems of, financing for herself, you'll find very widely different offerings based on who you talk to. And so that not taking the first, offer of credit would be the first thing that you look at. And then, it's okay too, if you're looking at a place to rent, to talk to the neighbors. What kind of landlord is this person? Do they fix things? Do they, because those kinds of things, if they devalue you as a person based on your color, that's going to show through in how they maintain their properties. That's going to show through on what they do to collect their rent and what kinds of things they do. And so we've got to really empower ourselves to do our homework.
And what I normally tell people to do is to make certain that whatever process you are going into, that you read and study before you enter. The same thing with people renting houses or renting apartments. There are a lot of guidebooks on fair housing and equal opportunity treatments. And I tell people, get a book, get a pamphlet, find a flyer, and read so that you will know what to expect in some instances. Discrimination is not overt like it used to be, but if you are prepared, if you go in and you are prepared, you have some idea of what equal treatment is all about, what it should sound like, what it should look like, then you have a better opportunity or better chance of not allowing yourself to be caught in a situation where you are taken advantage of. We tell people that if you go in to rent an apartment and you know something is available, you've read on their site that there are apartments available, and they tell you, well, there's nothing available, sorry, and suggest that you go somewhere else, depending upon where you go or where they suggest that you go might be a red flag to you right then, that they are discriminating against you, that they are trying to steer you to something less than what you want. I'm a victim of having been steered in a housing transaction. So I understand how it feels. I understand and listen and know what some of the signs are when I hear them. So I tell people, before you go out to do anything, if it's to get a loan, if it's to buy a house, if it's to rent, whatever the situation is, do your homework before you go.
Okay. I wanted to continue with that a little bit, and with this idea of the Fair Housing Act. What does the Fair Housing Act guarantee to renters or to purchasers? What should the average layperson know about that?
Well, first of all, it's supposed to guarantee you equal access. And that means equal access in the rental industry, equal access in sales. It offers, first of all, equal access to anybody who is seeking a housing transaction of any kind. That's the very first thing that it offers. That people must be treated equally, that they can't deny you or create reasons to deny you. They're supposed to offer to you the same thing that they would offer to anyone else in that situation who was asking for the same thing that you were asking for. So first of all, equal access to housing.
You know, the economic crisis that took place in 2008, it left scars on our country. As I drive through Birmingham, I'm old enough to remember where certain businesses were that never returned after 2008 and 2009, and I can't escape feeling that with the current pandemic we're in, the effects of it is going to leave scars. And in terms of those scars, what do you think should be done to ensure an equitable recovery from COVID in terms of housing and housing discrimination? You know, you hear the phrase "build back better." What should we be focusing on post-COVID to make things better for people in terms of housing?
So the thing that I'm most interested in right now, post-COVID, is what are we going to do with the evictions that have not been happening, or the evictions that are still happening that may not be lawful, and how people will deal with the inability to pay rent will be a very interesting. I think we are looking at a potentially very deep and wide housing crisis where lots of people will become homeless because as these programs that have helped people with rental assistance dissipate and evictions become more freely available, we're going to have a lot of people entering into the housing market, some with probably some tarnishes on their standing as renters, and who are going to have a very hard time finding a place to live.
Yeah, I think that we have to keep our pulse on that, because as you mentioned, you're going to have probably bad credit reports from not having been able to pay and things of that nature. And it's not like we are starting off on equal footing as it is. And then you're getting this setback that's lasted, just about a year now. And everything we know says it's going to be, not tomorrow before this is over. So it's an important thing to keep our eyes on. While we're talking about what the law can do and talking about COVID, another thing in terms of COVID I've seen in the media, attacks on people of Asian descent and the idea of these being hate crimes. Well, I'd like to steer that back into housing discrimination. As important as owning a house is, or basically just having a place to have shelter is, would you consider housing discrimination or rental discrimination? Would you consider that to be something that should be a hate crime?
Well, I mean, I think it kind of, hate crimes are interesting because they're all crimes, right? And I think it really depends upon the systemic nature of how people are operating, right? So we have most of, I think, the what we deal with, or at least when we're dealing with discrimination, is really one-to-one. But if you're looking at something from a larger perspective, if you have a bank who has systemically gone after, people of color or Asian people for predatory loans, or have, foreclosed on them in ways that they wouldn't have done other people. We also see this a lot, I think, with people who are in our immigrant communities who may or may not have status, where people are coming and doing things to them that they wouldn't do to other renters or buyers. And so, a hate crime, is generally hard to prove. And I think we often see those types of prosecutions not go well. But we do have to understand how to operate within the systems that we have. I mean, we do have the Fair Housing Act. The DOJ can, in theory, step into a fair housing case and help prosecute that when they see that there are issues. But we need to be very, very, very vigilant about bringing the issues that we see to DOJ. And I think a lot of times, especially lawyers, they might file something, and unless the DOJ is monitoring and figures it out, no one in Washington or in the U.S. Attorney's Office will know that this is going on. And there may be interest in that particular topic. And, right now, as we have a change in administration, we probably will be able to see a lot more activity in the discrimination front from the government's lawyers. And so I think it's just important for us to maybe strengthen the relationships we have with those who help enforce these laws.
If I can jump in there for a second.
Please.
I think that being in real estate, I've been in real estate 10 years, and I have the blessed opportunity to be the top executive staff person for a Black Real Estate Association, who was founded, around fair housing, right? And we know that every time tests are done, they catch bad people, whether it's for lending or for housing discrimination. And unless there are significant penalties, people will continue to do what they have been doing, which is discriminating against protected classes. And from 1968, a week after the assassination of Dr. King, until the 1987 or 88 amendment to the Fair Housing Act, it had no real teeth. Too much of the onus was on the consumer. And still to this day, as just indicated, if the Justice Department or state government doesn't take it seriously, doesn't really push it, then a lot of the onus is on the consumer. And then too many of our people accept discrimination, because they don't know. They think that's how it is. That's how it's always been. So we have to educate people. We do need to make more punitive damages. We saw just 2 years ago in Long Island, New York, where African Americans were trying to buy a house, and good jobs. They not only they steered them only to Black areas, some of the houses they required people to get show their tax return to see the house. So these are some of the crazy things that happen on a regular basis. The penalties are weak for housing discrimination, unless you're able to really get a federal judgment. We've got to have the hate crime, I think, can be a good thing because of the fact of this. The people that are most likely to be discriminated in housing are those same protected classes. And as long as we continue to give people a $500 fine or whatever those other smaller things are, and the penalties are not as significant, and it really requires the Justice Department, and if that Justice Department is under Trump, they look the other way, or they are not as aggressive. And then maybe if it's under Biden, maybe they're a little more aggressive. We need stronger penalties for housing discrimination in the country at the state level, at the federal level, and we haven't even gotten into the whole debate about source to income. We have a disproportionate number of our people on public assistance. My mom when I grew up, my mom was on Section 8, which is housing vouchers. A lot of our folks are discriminated in because they got kids or they're on public assistance. And most states and the federal law does not address source of income. So there's so many other things in the fair housing space that need more. They need a bigger bite and a bigger punch.
If I could quickly agree with Attorney Fontenot and Mr. Thompson, toward both of that, and the attorney mentioned this earlier. there has to be a comparison group. And one of the biggest blows that we had in the Trump administration, with even many sort of Democratic senators, were sort of the rollback of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which Mr. Thompson said, with that publicly available data. We're seeing this in real time. We want to know how many Black businesses or businesses of color, diverse businesses are getting loans from PPP and where. We have the same setup. And so without the academic community and others being able to analyze, it reduces the speed of the case that we can make against these innately prejudicial policies and systems. And then secondarily, I would say another really important piece that has also seen some popular media has been sort of discrimination or just outright hate with appraisals. There was a story even last week about a couple in Florida who had seen sort of this disparity in appraisals just because they had pictures of their Black family. So these are very critical things that we must push for, and I agree with both the panelists on that.
And I definitely agree with all three of the previous panelists. Actually, to make our job much easier at the Fair Housing Center, we definitely need source of income as a protected class. We need greater and larger settlements in a lot of the cases that we've handled. We need for people to be willing to speak out when they feel that they have been discriminated against. Part of the problem in filing cases often is that we can't get people to actually speak out. I was talking with someone earlier this afternoon, and we were talking about discrimination in the real estate industry, where we are finding realtors discriminating against each other. That's something that should definitely not happen. We are finding complaints, as I think Elijah said earlier, about appraisals. We're getting complaints about appraisals, similar homes in different communities, the appraisal price being sometimes $20,000 to $30,000 difference. This should never occur. So there are a lot of issues that we have locally that we need to address, and a lot of them could be addressed if people would actually speak out and acknowledge the fact that they have been discriminated against, or at least that they feel they have been discriminated against, and we can investigate those cases. We would be delighted to send systemic cases to HUD, and they will send them on to the Justice Department. But if we can't get people to actually admit that they have been discriminated against, or at least feel that they've been discriminated against and want some clarity on that, it ties our hands oftentimes in actually trying to resolve some of the problems that are existing in our communities. And so we ask people to, spread the word that there is information available so that people can be educated to know what housing discrimination is all about, so they can recognize what happens to them when they are in a housing transaction. People oftentimes are discriminated against, and they have absolutely no idea that that is what has happened to them, because in the first place, they didn't know what to expect. So they accept, as someone said earlier, whatever is given to them or offered to them. So we emphasize a lot of education in addition to our doing testing and investigations. And we certainly would love to be able to put some of these large cases together and give them to the Justice Department. We've had a couple of cases to go to Justice and to HUD, and we had excellent outcomes on those cases, but it's not something that happens that often.
Let me follow up, Ms. Hackett, if you don't mind. Quick question. What if I'm afraid? If I, I'm living here and I got my kids with me, and I'm afraid this person, you know, they have the pen. They let me move in this place, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to find another place to live. How should I handle that?
Well, if you come to us and call us or come into the office, anything that you do or say to us is kept privately. And we investigate based upon what the allegations are. Sometimes the person's name never has to be mentioned. There are situations that we can investigate that we never have to tell the respondent uh, who has filed a complaint against them until it's all done. If we refer it to HUD, HUD is going to inform the respondent. But if you're retaliated against for reporting an act of discrimination, in most instances, that doesn't do anything but put fuel to the fire, and it makes your case better. We don't want people to be discriminated against or retaliated against when they file a complaint, but that's a reality sometimes. But initially, once they come to us, nobody knows that they have told us what happened but them and us.
Well, before we go, I want to say, first of all, how much I have learned in this short time here with all of you. But I would really like to ask if either one of you would like to leave us with one piece of advice or just one thing that we should keep our eyes on as an intelligent and educated community in terms of housing and housing discrimination.
Well, as I've said a couple of times, I emphasize education. I think education in terms of your rights as a citizen, those rights that you are afforded under the Federal Fair Housing Act, you need to know what they are. You need to be involved in programs and other activities that will give you this information. A lot of it is online. People are using the internet now to find out a little of everything. So that's one way of getting that information. Our office is available. You can come in, you can call us. We do training sessions for the real estate industry, for mortgage lenders, for insurance, for builders. And so we are there to provide this information to the general public, excuse me. So education is the first thing that we say.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, Mr. Thompson, Attorney Fontenot, any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I just want to say first, thank you. Thank you for the rich history that your community has in the movement for change. We know that we have a lot of work to do. As I stated earlier, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King understood that the next phase of the civil rights movement was about civil rights, economic equity, combating redlining, making sure that we can restore, we can put neighbor in neighborhood. He understood that we must transform our communities, and we can't do that without capital. The federal government has been part of the problem. Too often, African Americans have been in a vicious cycle. Either we are shut out of mortgage financing or we are exploited. And so we have a lot of work to do on this issue. We know that white folks didn't get ahead by their own. They got a hand up and a hand out. And so we've got to make sure that the same efforts that were put, the same level of energy and systematic things that were put in place to advance the economic interests to create white wealth in America through home ownership, that those same efforts must be put forward for African Americans. We need an African American home ownership program the same way we have a VA bill, a VA program, a Native American housing program, an Alaskan and Hawaiian housing program out of the federal government. But there's not one for Black people. And we have to demand that and make it happen. And so this is 2021. People are talking about a racial reckoning, a racial awakening. Well, if we don't own more homes, we will be the spectators in this form of neo-apartheid that we live every single day. We can be the majority of people of color. We can have all these offices and elected positions. But if we don't own the land, we don't control what happens on the land. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say that, Dr. King did say there were three great evils. He said it was war, racism, and poverty. And so you're totally correct there. And we do have to educate ourselves. And this discussion this evening goes back to what I said a little while ago about you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know. Well, if you heard something this evening that sparks your interest, research it. And we have wonderful individuals here that can be followed up with. And we want to encourage you all to continue to support and follow the programming of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And thank you for your time and your talent this evening.